So, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us for today's NALP webinar, looking at the range of qualifications and how to choose which one is right for you. My name is Chantal Cook, I'm the CEO of NALP, and our expert guest is Tom Mortimer, our academic director. And Tom will be answering a whole load of questions about the qualifications that we have and any questions that you might have as well. But we'll be going through the different qualifications, explaining what they are, explaining who's eligible, and kind of what you will get from studying one of these Ofqual accredited qualifications. Now, before I introduce Tom properly and we actually start, I just want to let you know something that I think is actually really important when choosing a qualification, and that is to choose a qualification that is Ofqual accredited. And why is that important? Because that means that our qualifications, now the qualifications are externally verified effectively. It means it's not us that's saying that they're good. It's not us that's checking them and quality controlling them, although of course we're doing that all the time as well. But actually it's somebody else on the outside is looking at them and going, is this good enough? Is this fit for purpose? Is this organization the right kind of organization to deliver these? Oh, is this organization solid and reliable and all those kind of things? That's what the Ofqual accreditation means. When you look at other qualifications that are internally regulated, in other words, they're regulated by themselves effectively or another part of their organization, for example, then that's not to say they're bad qualifications. It just means nobody has externally verified those qualifications. So when you're looking at qualifications, you really want to look for that external verification, and Ofqual gives you that external verification. Okay, that's my little Ofqual lecture over. So I'm now going to introduce Tom. And my first question to Tom, who is our academic director at NALP, is actually to explain levels, because we talk about level 3, 5, 7, etc. And what on earth does that mean? You know, is it something that we've made up? Is it something that's understood externally as well? Tom, can you please shed the light on levels?
I will try. Basically, it picks up really on a point that you've already made about Ofqual. And what levels are is levels are basically a standard, and that standard is laid down by government. So it's again an objective standard. It's not something that NALP have made up. It's not something that any provider has made up. If you offer a qualification at a particular level, then there is an expectation and a requirement that that level is verifiable. So what we as an awarding organisation have to do is we have to make sure that our level 3, our level 4, our level 5 qualifications all comply with those objective standards laid down by government. So what are the levels? And basically the answer to that question, and I'll try and do this as briefly as I can, is that there are levels at level 1 all the way through to level 8. And qualifications all fit within those different levels. So just to give you some very quick examples so you can get an idea of how they kind of come together. Level 1 and 2 are basically GCSE level. So if you've done really well in your GCSEs, if you've got what is now a grade 4 to 9, that would be treated as a level 2 qualification. If you get less than a 4, then that would be treated as a level 1. A BTEC first is another example of a level 1 or 2 qualification. And intermediate apprenticeships, which some of you may have heard about, that's an example of a level 2 qualification. Level 3 is essentially equivalent to A level or international baccalaureate, BTEC national, those kind of qualifications. And that's also where advanced apprenticeships fall in as well. They are a level 3 qualification. Level 4, 5, and 6, they are like the equivalent years on a degree. So level 4 is like the first year of a degree. That would give you a certificate in higher education. Level 5 is equivalent to the second year of a degree. Level 6 to the final year of a degree. And that's also those three grades, 4, 5, and 6. That's also where higher apprenticeships come in as well. And then at level 7, we've got master's degrees. And at level 8, that's where we have doctorates. So if you were doing, for example, a higher apprenticeship, that would fit within 4 to 6. That's equivalent basically to a degree. If you're doing a degree apprenticeship, that's equivalent to level 6 on that scale. So that's a very, very quick summary of kind of how those different levels work. But they do matter because the level that you achieve means then not only that you have that piece of paper, that qualification, but it also means that that enables you to then move on to a higher level qualification than the one you've just completed. And that is what training providers or academic institutions would be looking for in order to assess your eligibility for the qualification that you want to move on to.
Now, if you've listened to all that and you're thinking, oh gosh, that's an awful lot to take in, don't worry, because this webinar does get recorded and it will go onto the NALP website and it will be accessible. So if you feel you need to listen to that again just to really absorb it, then don't worry. Give us a few days, probably about a week, and then you'll see it on the NALP website and you can absolutely listen to it again as many times as you need to make sure you've understood that. So thank you, Tom. That does make sense. But can you give us an example? Because it's all very well, kind of, I understand it kind of theoretically, but in practice, if you were to have a question in an exam, for example, what's the difference between those different levels of how that question might be phrased, perhaps, and also how you might be answering it?
Okay. And that's a really important question because what we have to do, exactly like Chantal has just said, we have to take that theory about levels and we have to map that theory into practice. So if I may, let's take the example within criminal law that some of you might be familiar with. And hopefully, what you will know from if you've studied criminal law, and if you haven't yet, then you certainly will get to know it. There are two main things that you need to be clear about with criminal law. The first one is what are the key elements of a crime? And the second one is what are the defenses to a crime? So let's try and use that as an example to illustrate how that would reflect the different levels that we've talked about. So if you were studying for a level 2 or level 3 qualification, then you would be likely to get a question in an assessment that might say something like, what are the key elements of a crime? Or what are the main defenses to a crime? So what you've got there is a very clear, very structured, very specific direction as to what the examiner is looking for. And that is what would happen at level 2 or 3. Now, let's imagine that we take the same kind of topic, but we move it to level 4. How might that question at level 4 be different? At level 4, the question might be structured like this, and forgive the examples and the names. Jack and Jill have been drinking all afternoon. Jane is sitting on a window ledge, and as a joke, Jack is sitting on a window ledge, and as a joke, Jill pushes Jack out of the window, seriously injuring Jack. Advise Jack. Now, that question is exactly the same in terms of the content that we looked at before. It's about the elements of a crime and it's about defenses. But hopefully, what you can see from that is that you're not being as clearly directed to the areas that you have got to talk about. What the examiner is doing is the examiner is expecting you to be able to identify from the facts what the issues are and then advise that. So it's exactly the same in terms of issues, but the burden, the responsibility is on you to identify what those issues are and advise. And then if we take the same example at level five, the question might be even more detailed. So you get something like, Jack and Jill are in a civil partnership for the last 5 years. In the last 2 years, Jill has been verbally and on occasion physically abusive to Jack. After spending lunch in the pub, on their return home, Jill again verbally abuses Jack and goes to hit him with a hammer. Jack stabs Jill, causing serious injury to Jill. Advise Jack. Now, again, hopefully what you can see is that is a much more complex question, even than it was at level 4. But the issues, what is a crime, what are the defenses, are still the key elements that run through the scenario. Again, the difference is the onus is on you to identify what those issues are. So they are much more complex problems, much more sophisticated. And if you think about it, this is exactly what happens in practice. You don't get clients generally coming in and say, can you tell me what the key elements of a crime are? But what you will do is you'll get Jack coming to your office and telling you his tales of woe, as we've just seen in that level 4 and 5 example. And you then have to pick the bones out of it. You have to identify what the legal issues are, which are underpinning that question.
So hopefully that's made it kind of clear what the difference is, because I know it can sometimes look like, oh, well, I'm studying the same thing again. No, you're not. It is actually, as Tom has just demonstrated, very different. So having had that example, having got an understanding of generally what the different levels are and where they sit kind of within the educational hierarchy, can we take a quick look at each of the NALP levels and the qualifications? So starting with level 3, and then we'll work our way along to those later qualifications.
Okay, so basically at level 3, to go back to the point that we were making about the levels, what we're trying to do at level 3 is very much to look at building a foundation. So if I can use a slightly different analogy to illustrate how this works, if you can imagine an iceberg, with an iceberg, you can see some of it sticking out of the water. The problem, as the Titanic found, was that it's not just the bit that's sticking out of the water that you need to be wary of, but it's also the bit that you can't see that is below. And that might seem like a silly example, but it's actually quite important. Because if you think about the bit of the iceberg that you can see as being the what do I need to know about law, that is what we are trying to reflect in the subjects that you will study at level 3. So at level 3, we're very much about trying to show you what the law is. That's why you do the introduction to law for paralegals. What the professional conduct expectations are on you as a member of the legal profession. What the law of contract is, and contract is at level 3, because we think it's a topic that lots of students find quite interesting, but also because it is a very, very common subject that underpins lots of other legal subjects. If any of you are involved in, for example, conveyancing is pretty much based on contract law. There are some exceptions, but it is fundamentally based on contract law. And then the final unit that you look at level 3 is the introduction to litigation and dispute resolution. And what we're really trying to do in that unit is we're trying to link that unit back to your further studies. So the things, for example, that you've studied, particularly in Unit 1, are also very relevant when you come on to study Unit 4 at level 3. And what we're trying to get you to start to do is to stop treating subjects like silos, like individual tracks that you basically just don't look at anything else. Law's not like that. Law is very much an integrated subject, and therefore it's a really important skill that you need to be able to develop, which is the skill to look not only in subjects, but also across subjects. And that's why we've structured level 3 in the way we have. Moving on to level 4, here we have English legal system. So you might say to me, well, why are we doing that again? We've done introduction to law on level 3. And the answer to that question is that for 2 reasons. One is because in English legal system, because it's at level 4, we're now going into things that you've touched on at level 3 in more detail. So if you go back to my iceberg, what we are now asking you to do is not only look at what the law is, the bit of the iceberg you can see, but also to start to think about why the law is the way it is. So, for example, at level 3, you'll have talked about precedent, the idea judges follow earlier cases. At level 4 in English legal system, you'll do precedent again, but we will now be looking at why do we have precedent? What are the alternatives that we could have to the system of precedent? And do those alternatives work more effectively than the system of precedent itself? So we're starting to look not just at the what, but also what is underneath the why. And then at level 4, we also have tort, criminal law, and employment. And again, what we're looking at is those subjects have been chosen because they build on the skills, the knowledge, the what that you will have started to develop at level 4. And then finally, and very quickly, at level 5, we're then moving it up another notch. So again, if you think back to our discussion about levels, at level 5, we're now interested, of course, in what the law is, but much more than that, we're interested in why the law is the way it is. What is it that makes it work in that way? How do these subjects fit together? And that's why the other really significant thing about levels is that we've chosen subjects at level 5 which are more involved, more complicated areas of law. And that's why we're looking at land law and conveyancing. That's a difficult conceptual subject. And it will involve, for example, going into contract in a lot more detail in a different context. We're looking at matrimonial and civil partnership. Again, a much more layered, much more nuanced subject. Public and EU, which some institutions call constitutional law. Again, building on things that you'll have ticked on in English legal system and introduction to law, how law is made, but looking at it in a much more deeper, contextualized, complex kind of way. And then finally, business law and practice, which basically pulls a number of those different things that you've studied previously together to look at them in the context of business law. So it's a bit, to mix my analogies, it's a bit like an onion. But what we're doing is we're taking the layers away. At level 3, we look at it and say, yep, that's an onion. At level 4, we pull some of the layers of the onion away and look at it in more depth. At level 5, we pull even more of the layers away and look at it at even greater depth. And then that continues up the chain.
Lovely. Thank you, Tom. So hopefully that gives everybody a kind of a broad idea of how the levels are different. And I think the key thing to remember here is that it's kind of like staged learning in a way. So you don't just jump in somewhere and go, all right, this is everything I need to know. You have to understand the stuff that comes before.
Yes.
And that may come before through an NALP qualification, or it may come before because you've done, a law A level or first year of a law degree or something like that. There are various ways in which you can have that previous information, but you do have to draw on that. You can't
Exactly.
just leap in out of a vacuum kind of thing. So hopefully that gives you a much better idea of what's covered and who would be eligible for what. If you've got any questions for Tom, please do pop them in the chat. Also remember that there is a full list of our qualifications, the eligibility, and also the learning that you can have done beforehand that will count towards the level that you might be looking at right now. So in other words, helping you decide, am I eligible to do a level 4, or do I have to do a level 3 first, or whatever it happens to be. That is all on our website. We've got a link for you in the chat that you can jump straight to as well to see that. If you're at all confused about it and you're looking at it and going, oh, I don't know, am I level 4 or level 5 or whatever your question is, then if you've already chosen a NALP accredited centre, then go straight to your centre and have a chat with them. They will be able to fill you in and answer those questions. If you haven't yet got to that stage and you're still thinking, then by all means contact NALP. You can see our contact details on our website. You can give us a call between 10 and 1 so 10 a.m. and 1 p.m, or you can drop us an email, and then one of our team will come back to you and kind of help you assess which part of the eligibility bit you need to understand and which qualification is right for you. So help is always there. As I mentioned, this webinar has also been recorded and it's going to go on the website. So if you feel that you need to listen to bits of it again to help you fully understand it, please do so. It'll be there sort of forever pretty much. So you've got plenty of time to go back in and listen to that whenever you need to. So I think just to round up, Tom, is there anything you'd like to sort of emphasize, particularly before we finish, about these different qualifications and how to choose the right one for you? Any sort of final thoughts for students?
Well, if I may, I'll make 2 quick points. The first one is just picking up on something that you said earlier on. If learners have uh, qualifications which are at a similar level, so if, for example, you have the first year of a degree and you're trying to decide whether to come on to do the now level 4 or level 5, what we can also offer you is we can offer you accreditation of your prior learning. So what that means in English is that we can offer you exemptions. And that's something that we can talk through with you on an individual basis. But secondly, I think the main point I would like to make in relation to today is the qualification that you can go on to do is very much dependent on the level of qualification that you have already successfully completed. So, for example, very quickly, if you've completed a level 3 qualification, like an A level, we would not expect you, and indeed you would not be allowed to go on to do a level 7 qualification because there is a great big gap between level 3, level 4, and level 7. And it would be very unfair of now to expect you to be able to jump that gap in your learning. And that is also why the government has laid down these levels so that learners can be sure that as they move to the next level, that they have the foundation, the principles, the underpinning that they need in order to be able to cope with the next level up.
Lovely, thank you. So again, before we just finish, if anybody's got a question, this is your last chance to pop it into the chat. If I don't see it there in the next few seconds, then I will assume there aren't any questions and that Tom has covered everything that you need to know. So thank you so much, Tom, for joining us and for making that so clear. Hopefully the lack of questions is because exactly that. You've explained everything that needs to be understood. If you do have anything after this webinar that you think, oh, I didn't understand that or whatever, please listen again or get in touch with us or your NALP centre and we'll be able to answer those questions for you. And a quick reminder, our next webinar will be how to study for your exams, getting yourself prepared for exams, and that'll be on the 16th of October. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Thank you, Tom, for your time and explaining that also very clearly. Much appreciated. And we look forward to seeing you all on the 16th of October. Thanks very much.